People often ask me why I'm so cautious, why I have 3 different security cameras at my door, why I make my grandchildren text me before they visit. They think I'm just being a paranoid old woman. But they weren't there that autumn day in 1982, when a man in a gray suit knocked on my door and nearly turned me into another statistic. I've never told this story publicly before, but I think it's time. Maybe it'll help someone else trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right. I was 67 years old, living alone in my 2-story farmhouse just outside of Pine River, Minnesota. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where you could leave your doors unlocked at night and your keys in the car. My husband George had passed away 3 years earlier, and my children, bless their hearts, had been trying to convince me to move closer to them in Minneapolis. But I was stubborn. Still am, if I'm being honest. That house held 40 years of memories. The marks on the doorframe showing my children's growth, the flower garden George and I had planted together, the kitchen where I'd taught my daughters to bake. I couldn't imagine leaving it all behind. That Tuesday afternoon in late September started like any other. The weather had turned early that year, bringing a chill that had me thinking about pulling out the winter quilts. I'd spent the morning canning the last batch of tomatoes from my garden. I always grew too many, but George used to say you could never have too many home-canned tomatoes. The kitchen still smelled of warm vinegar and spices when I finally sat down with my crossword puzzle and a cup of tea. I remember checking the clock, 2:17 p.m., when I heard the knock. It was the kind of knock that meant business. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced. Through the frost glass of my front door, I could make out the silhouette of a man in what appeared to be a suit. Professional looking, which was unusual for our area. Most visitors were neighbors in flannel shirts or the occasional Jehovah's Witness. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was his smile. It's funny how some details stick with you, even 40 years later. His smile showed too many teeth and didn't quite reach his eyes, which were a pale, watery blue behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with neat brown hair just starting to gray at the temples. His suit was pressed perfectly, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, the kind of attention to detail that seemed almost obsessive. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, reaching into his breast pocket. "I'm Thomas Kendrick with the U.S. Census Bureau. We're conducting a special regional survey about household composition and community demographics." He held up an ID badge and a leather wallet, flipping it open with practiced efficiency. Now, I'd worked as a school teacher for 30 years before retiring. And one thing you learn in teaching is how to spot when something's not quite right. The badge looked official at first glance, but something about it nagged at me. The photo seemed slightly askew, and the lamination had bubbles in it. Little details I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't spent 3 decades checking hall passes and student IDs. But it was 1982, and we didn't have the internet telling us stories about scammers and home invasions every day. Besides, he pulled out an official-looking packet of papers with the Census Bureau letterhead, all crisp and professional. "I know this isn't our usual time for census collection," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "But we're gathering additional data for a federal housing initiative. It should only take about 20 minutes of your time." I hesitated, just for a moment, and that's when I first noticed how his eyes darted past me, scanning what he could see of my home. Later, when I gave my statement to the police, they told me that was a common tactic. Criminals casing a house, looking for security systems, checking for signs of other occupants. But at the time, I was raised to be polite and to respect government officials. So I did what any good Midwestern woman would do. I invited him in. The sound of his shoes on my hardwood floors should have been another warning. Click, 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 precise as a metronome. He moved with purpose, taking in everything. I offered him coffee, which he declined, and we sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd raised my family, where my grandchildren still gathered during their visits. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward us like grasping fingers. His questions started normally enough. How long had I lived in the house? What was the square footage? How many bedrooms? But then they began to shift, becoming more personal. He wanted to know about my daily routine, when I usually went to grocery shopping, which church I attended, and on what days. Each question made me more uneasy, but he had an answer for everything. It was all for understanding community patterns, he said, for improving local services. I noticed his eyes kept drifting to my walls, particularly to the collection of family photos I had hanging there. Like most grandmothers, I had what my children called a brag wall. Pictures from every graduation, wedding, and special occasion. There was Sarah in her cap and gown, Michael with his new bride, and several of my grandchildren at various ages. He seemed especially interested in a recent photo of my youngest granddaughter, Emma, playing in my backyard. "Lovely family," he commented, his pen tapping against his notepad. The tapping was irregular, almost nervous, and it made me think of a spider's legs twitching. "Do they visit often?" "Sometimes," I said, growing increasingly uncomfortable with his interest. "When they can make the drive up from the cities." He nodded, writing something in his notebook. The scratching of his pen seemed unnaturally loud in my quiet kitchen. "And you're here alone most of the time?" That question sent ice through my veins. In 30 years of teaching, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people. Something in his tone had changed. There was an eagerness that hadn't been there before, like a child spotting an unguarded cookie jar. "My son comes by regularly," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "He lives just down the road." His smile tightened slightly, and his pen stopped moving. "That wasn't mentioned in our preliminary data." I stood up, proud that my hands weren't shaking as badly as I felt they should be. "Would you excuse me for a moment? I need to use the bathroom." He nodded, his eyes following me as I left the kitchen. I counted his pen taps until I was out of sight. Tap, 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 tap. Instead of going to the bathroom, I slipped into my bedroom and closed the door quietly. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely dial the phone, but I managed to call my neighbor, Ruth Peterson. Ruth had been my neighbor for 20 years, and she had the sharpest mind of anyone I knew. She also had the good sense to keep her phone by her chair while she did her afternoon crocheting. She answered on the second ring. "Ruth," I whispered, cupping my hand around the receiver. "There's a man here claiming to be from the Census Bureau, but something's not right. Could you call them and check? And maybe call the police too?" Ruth, bless her heart, didn't hesitate. "I'm on it, Helen. Don't let on that anything's wrong. Bob's home. I'll send him over right away." I flushed the toilet to maintain the pretense, and took 3 deep breaths before returning to the kitchen. The man, if his name was really Thomas Kendrick, was standing by my wall of photos, studying them intently. When he heard me return, he quickly sat back down, but I noticed his notebook was in a slightly different position on the table. The corner was aligned perfectly with the table's edge now, where before it had been askew. "Just a few more questions, Mrs. Larson," he said, using my name for the first time, a name I hadn't given him. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to sit down. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, like a drum at a funeral march. I tried to keep my voice steady as I settled back into my chair. "Actually, I just remembered I have a doctor's appointment I need to get to. Perhaps we could reschedule?" His expression darkened for just a moment before he caught himself, like a mask slipping and being quickly readjusted. "This won't take long. Now, about your basement." Before I could answer, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Bob Peterson's old Ford truck, with its distinctive rattling muffler, pulling into my driveway. The man heard it too, and his demeanor changed instantly, like a switch being flipped. "Well, I think I have everything I need," he said, gathering his papers quickly. His movements were precise but hurried now, like a wind-up toy going too fast. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Larson." He was out the door before I could say anything else, walking briskly to a dark blue sedan parked on the street. As he pulled away, I caught a glimpse of the license plate. It was from Wisconsin. I remember thinking how odd that was, a Wisconsin census worker in Minnesota. Bob Peterson came to my door just as the car disappeared around the corner. By then, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. Ruth arrived a few minutes later with news that would make my blood run even colder. The Census Bureau had confirmed they had no one conducting surveys in our area, and certainly no one named Thomas Kendrick. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Jensen, who'd known me since he was a boy in my 3rd grade class, took my statement. As I recounted everything, other details began surfacing. Things I hadn't consciously noticed, but my mind had recorded anyway. How the man's tie had been perfectly centered, how his notebook had been precisely aligned with the table edge, how he'd touched each photo frame with exactly 3 fingers. When they checked my kitchen, they discovered that 3 photos were missing from my wall, recent ones of my grandchildren at my house. The spaces where they'd been looked like missing teeth in a smile. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before, knowing this stranger had been studying my family, memorizing our faith. The next 2 weeks were a blur of police interviews and newspaper reporters. My children wanted me to move to Minneapolis immediately, but I refused. I was scared, yes, but I was also angry. This man had invaded my home, threatened my sense of security, stolen memories of my grandchildren. I wasn't about to let him chase me away. But I did make changes. Bob Peterson installed better locks on all my doors and windows. Ruth and I set up a check-in system. I'd call her every morning and evening, and she'd do the same. My son Michael drove up and installed motion sensor lights around the house. We all became more vigilant, more aware. Then, 17 days after his visit, I got a call from Officer Jensen. They'd arrested a man matching his description in Wisconsin Rapids, about 200 miles away. A routine traffic stop had led to the discovery of hundreds of family photos in his trunk. Photos taken from homes across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. But it was what they found in his apartment that truly terrified me. The notebooks. Dozens of them, filled with detailed descriptions of elderly residents, mostly women living alone. Our daily routines, when we got mail, when we went grocery shopping, when family visited. Some of the entries dated back several years. My name was in there, along with detailed notes about my house, my schedule, even the location of my bedroom. They never told me exactly what they suspected he was planning, but I could guess. The detective who kept me updated mentioned other cases, home invasions targeting elderly residents, always in homes that had been carefully studied beforehand. Some had ended tragically. In one case, they found a woman's driver's license in his apartment, but they never found her. I moved to Minneapolis that spring, finally taking my children's advice. The farmhouse held too many shadows now. Too many memories of that afternoon when everything changed. I installed security cameras at my new place, something I never thought I'd do. I check IDs more carefully now, and I never open my door to strangers when I'm alone. His real name wasn't Thomas Kendrick. That was just one of many aliases he used. They found census worker IDs from 6 different states in his apartment, along with utility worker badges, insurance agent credentials, and even a minister's collar. Each one perfect for gaining the trust of someone like me, someone raised to be polite and helpful to officials and people of authority. I'm 89 now, and I still get chills when someone unexpected knocks on my door. My grandchildren are grown, with children of their own, and they think I'm just being a paranoid old woman when I lecture them about checking IDs and being careful who they let into their homes. But they didn't sit across from pure evil at their kitchen table, making small talk while it studied their family photos and made notes about their habits. Last month, I read about a similar case in Florida. Someone posing as a utility worker, targeting elderly residents. Some things never change. The predators just wear different uniforms. But maybe by sharing my story, I can help someone else listen to that small voice inside that says something isn't quite right. Because that voice, it might just save your life. I still have the habit of looking at ID badges carefully, noting the little details. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about those notebooks, about all the other houses he visited, all the other families he studied. How many close calls were there before they caught him? How many others like him are still out there, wearing suits and carrying clipboards, waiting for someone to open their door and invite them in? But I try not to dwell on these thoughts too much. Instead, I focus on being grateful. Grateful for Ruth's quick thinking, for Bob's timely arrival, for all the little coincidences that kept me from becoming more than just another entry in those terrible notebooks. And I'm grateful that I can share my story now, hoping it might help someone else trust their instincts when something feels wrong. The world has changed a lot since 1982. We have caller ID now, security cameras, background check websites. But some things haven't changed at all. Evil still comes dressed in suits, carrying briefcases and official papers, hiding darkness behind pleasant smiles and government badges. And sometimes the difference between safety and tragedy is as simple as paying attention to the little details that don't quite add up. They caught him, yes. He'll never hurt anyone again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my house and I hear an unexpected knock, I'm right back at that kitchen table, watching his pen tapping against his notebook, counting the seconds until help arrives. And I remember what he taught me, that monsters don't always hide under beds or in dark alleys. Sometimes they come to your door in broad daylight, wearing a smile and carrying a census form.